My cousin insisted I cater his entire wedding for free, saying, "It'll be great exposure for your business." When I declined, he rolled her eyes. "Fine. I'll find someone better." Soul skipped the wedding. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls. I, 32M, own a small catering business that I built from the ground up over the last 6 years. It's not some massive operation, just me, 2 full-time staff members, and a handful of part-timers I bring in for larger events. We do well enough: weddings, corporate functions, birthday parties. The work is steady, the clients are usually reasonable, and I've managed to carve out a decent reputation in our mid-sized city. My cousin, though, seemed to think that because we shared a last name and some childhood memories, my services should come with a family discount. By discount, I mean free. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was prepping for a corporate luncheon the next day. My cousin asked if I had a minute to talk about his upcoming wedding, and I told him sure. "Congratulations. When was the date?" He said it was in 6 weeks, a Saturday in late September, and then he launched into the pitch. He needed catering for about 150 guests, full service, appetizers, main course, dessert, the works. He described his vision: elegant but not stuffy, memorable but affordable, and I listened while mentally calculating the cost. Labor, ingredients, rentals, transportation. We were talking $15,000 to $20,000 minimum, probably closer to 25 if he wanted anything remotely close to what he was describing. Then he dropped the line. He said it would be great exposure for my business, that his fiancé's family was well-connected, and that I'd probably get several bookings out of it. He said it casually, like he was doing me a favor, like I should be thanking him for the opportunity. I stopped chopping onions and asked him to clarify, and he said he was hoping I could do it for free as a wedding gift. Family helping family, he said. I could feel my jaw tightening. I told him I couldn't do that. I explained that a wedding of that size required significant resources, that I'd have to turn down paying clients to make room for it, and that my business couldn't absorb that kind of loss. I said I'd be happy to give him a family discount, maybe 15% off, but free wasn't an option. There was a long pause, and then he scoffed. He said he thought family meant something to me, that he was disappointed, and that he expected more. I told him I understood he was disappointed, but my answer wasn't changing. He rolled his eyes. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it in his voice, and said fine, he'd find someone better. Then he hung up. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at my phone, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. We hadn't been particularly close growing up, but we'd never had any real conflict either. Our families got together for holidays, exchanged pleasantries, kept things cordial. This felt like a line being crossed, but I tried to shake it off. I had work to do, and I wasn't going to let his entitlement ruin my evening. The weeks passed, and I didn't hear from him again. I saw a few posts on social media about the wedding preparations, countdowns, dress fittings, venue tours. My aunt called once to ask if I was coming to the wedding, and I told her I hadn't received an invitation. She sounded confused and said she was sure one had been sent, but I checked my mail and my email and found nothing. I didn't push it. If he didn't want me there, fine. I had a busy season ahead anyway, and one less obligation on my calendar wasn't exactly a tragedy. The wedding was on a Saturday, and I spent that morning doing a tasting for a potential client, a young couple planning an intimate garden wedding for the following spring. They were enthusiastic and appreciative, asking thoughtful questions about menu options and dietary accommodations. It was the kind of interaction that reminded me why I loved this work. By early afternoon, I was back home, catching up on invoices and inventory orders. My phone was on silent, and I was fully absorbed in spreadsheets when the evening rolled around. I went to bed around 11, satisfied with a productive day, and didn't think about my cousin or his wedding at all. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, dozens of them. Text messages. Voicemails. I rubbed my eyes and scrolled through the notifications, my confusion growing with each swipe. My aunt, my uncle, my mother, several cousins I barely spoke to, even my grandmother. All of them trying to reach me, all within the span of a few hours late the previous night and early that morning. I called my mother first. She answered on the first ring and immediately asked where I'd been, why I hadn't answered my phone, if I knew what had happened. I told her I'd been asleep, that my phone was on silent, and asked her to slow down and explain. She took a breath and said the wedding had been a disaster. The caterer my cousin hired never showed up. No food, no staff, no communication. 150 guests arrived at the reception venue expecting a full meal, and there was nothing. The venue had a small kitchen, but no ingredients, no preparation. My cousin and his new wife were frantic. His in-laws were furious, and the whole thing fell apart. Guests left early. Some went to nearby restaurants. Others just went home. It was humiliating. I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me, followed quickly by a surge of vindication. I asked my mother why everyone was calling me, and she hesitated before saying that my cousin had apparently told several family members I'd agreed to cater the wedding and then backed out at the last minute. He'd painted me as the villain, the selfish relative who'd ruined his big day out of spite. I felt my blood pressure spike. I told my mother that wasn't true, that he'd asked me to do it for free, that I'd declined, and that he'd told me he'd find someone else. She was quiet for a moment, then said she believed me, but that the rest of the family was in an uproar. I spent the next hour fielding calls and texts, telling the same story over and over. Some family members believed me immediately. Others were skeptical, asking why I hadn't at least tried to help, why I'd let pride get in the way of family. I reminded them that I ran a business, not a charity, and that I'd offered a discount which had been rejected. The more I explained, the more exhausted I felt. By mid-morning, my phone was still ringing, and I decided I needed to take control of the narrative. I opened the text thread with my cousin. Our last exchange had been his curt goodbye after I declined his request. I typed out a message asking what had happened with his caterer and why he was telling people I'd agreed to do the wedding. I kept it direct, no accusations, just questions. He read it almost immediately, but didn't respond. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. Nothing. My aunt called again, this time sounding more frantic. She said my cousin and his wife were devastated, that the wedding had cost them a fortune and now they had nothing to show for it. She asked if there was any way I could help, maybe put together something small, a gesture of goodwill. I told her I sympathized, but I wasn't going to fix a problem that wasn't my fault. She said she understood, but that the family was falling apart over this, that people were taking sides. I told her I was sorry she was caught in the middle, but my position hadn't changed. By the afternoon, more details started emerging. Apparently, my cousin had hired a budget caterer he'd found online, someone with minimal reviews and a suspiciously low quote. He'd paid a deposit but hadn't signed a detailed contract. The caterer had confirmed the booking via email, but when the wedding day arrived, they were unreachable. Phone disconnected, email bouncing back, no trace. It was either a scam or gross incompetence, and my cousin had no recourse. He'd been so confident he'd find someone better, so eager to prove he didn't need me, that he'd cut corners and gambled on a deal that was too good to be true. I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of poetic justice. He'd dismissed my expertise, insulted my business, and then tried to throw me under the bus when his own poor decision backfired. But the calls kept coming, and the pressure kept mounting. Several family members suggested I should have warned him, should have offered to help even after he rejected my terms, should have put family first. I was painted as cold, unforgiving, petty. It was infuriating. That evening, my cousin finally responded to my text. He said the caterer had scammed him, that he was humiliated and broke, and that he hadn't meant to imply I'd agreed to cater the wedding. He said things had gotten confused in the chaos, that people had misunderstood. It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. I asked him directly if he'd told anyone I'd backed out at the last minute, and after another long pause, he admitted he might have said something in the heat of the moment that people took the wrong way. He apologized, but it felt hollow. I told him I accepted his apology, but that he needed to set the record straight with the family. He agreed, reluctantly, and said he'd make some calls. I didn't trust him to follow through, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. Update 1. I drafted a message and sent it to the family group chat, something we rarely used except for coordinating holiday dinners and sharing photos. I laid out the timeline clearly. My cousin had asked me to cater his wedding for free. I'd declined and offered a discount instead. He'd rejected that offer and told me he'd find someone better. I hadn't been invited to the wedding, and I'd had no contact with him until the morning after, when I woke up to accusations that I'd abandoned him. I kept it factual, unemotional, and attached screenshots of our text conversation where he'd dismissed me and hung up. The response was immediate and divided. Some family members apologized for doubting me, saying they should have asked for my side before jumping to conclusions. Others doubled down, saying I should have risen above it, that I could have prevented the disaster if I'd just been more generous. My grandmother, surprisingly, sent me a private message saying she was proud of me for standing my ground, that my cousin had always been entitled, and that maybe this would teach him a lesson. It was the validation I hadn't realized I needed. My cousin, predictably, didn't take it well. He sent me a private message accusing me of airing dirty laundry, of making him look worse when he was already down. I told him he'd made himself look bad by lying to the family, and that I wasn't going to let him ruin my reputation to save his own. He called me petty and selfish, and I blocked him. I didn't have the energy for more circular arguments. The next few days were tense. My mother tried to play peacemaker, suggesting we all sit down and talk things through, but I refused. There was nothing to talk through. I'd done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to apologize for running my business professionally. My aunt stopped calling, and I got the sense she was embarrassed by the whole situation. A few cousins reached out privately to say they agreed with me, but didn't want to get involved publicly, which I understood even if it frustrated me. What surprised me most was the aftermath within the wider family. The story spread, as family drama always does, and suddenly I was getting calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were supportive, saying they'd had similar experiences with entitled family members expecting free services. Others were nosy, fishing for more details to fuel their own gossip. I kept my responses brief and moved on. About a week after the wedding, I got a call from an unknown number. It was my cousin's wife. She apologized for the mess, said she hadn't known the full story until after everything blew up, and that she was mortified by how her husband had handled it. She said she'd been the one encouraging him to hire the budget caterer because they were trying to save money, and she felt partially responsible for the disaster. I appreciated her honesty and told her I held no grudge against her. She asked if there was any way we could move forward, maybe rebuild some bridges, and I told her that depended entirely on her husband's willingness to take accountability. She sighed and said she'd try to talk to him, but I got the sense she knew it was a lost cause. We ended the call on polite terms, and I haven't heard from her since. Update 2. A month later, things had mostly settled down. The family drama had faded into the background, replaced by other gossip and concerns. I'd lost contact with my cousin entirely, and I was fine with that. My business, ironically, did get a boost from the whole situation. Word spread about what had happened, and several people reached out to book my services specifically because they'd heard I refused to compromise my standards, even for family. One client told me she respected that I valued my work enough to say no, and that she wanted someone with that level of professionalism handling her event. I also started getting inquiries from people who'd been guests at my cousin's wedding. They'd seen the chaos firsthand and wanted to make sure their own events didn't end the same way. A few of them became repeat clients, and one even left a glowing review online mentioning how reliable and professional it was compared to the horror story they'd witnessed. It was the kind of exposure my cousin had promised, just not in the way he'd intended. The family dynamics shifted in subtle ways. Some relatives distanced themselves, either out of loyalty to my cousin or discomfort with the conflict. Others grew closer, bonding over shared frustrations with entitled family members. My grandmother started inviting me over for lunch more often, and we'd spend hours talking about business, life, and the importance of boundaries. She told me stories about her own struggles setting limits with family, and I realized how much I'd underestimated her wisdom. My mother eventually admitted she'd been too quick to pressure me into helping, that she'd let her desire to keep the peace cloud her judgment. She apologized, and I forgave her. We were family, after all, and I understood the impulse to smooth things over even when it wasn't fair. Update 3. 3 months after the wedding, I was catering a corporate holiday party when I ran into my cousin's wife at the venue. She was there for the same event, attending as a guest with her company. We made awkward eye contact across the room, and I debated whether to acknowledge her or just focus on my work. She made the decision for me, walking over during a lull and asking if we could talk. She told me she and my cousin had separated, not officially divorced yet, but living apart and seeing a counselor. She said the wedding disaster had been the breaking point in a relationship that had been strained for a while. The financial stress, the family fallout, the realization that he'd lied to everyone to cover his own mistakes, it had all been too much. She said she didn't blame me, that she was actually grateful the whole thing had happened because it forced her to see things clearly. I didn't know what to say. I offered some generic condolences, and she waved them off, saying she was relieved more than anything. She asked how I was doing, and I told her business was good, life was stable. She smiled and said she was glad, that I deserved it. We chatted for a few more minutes before she had to rejoin her colleagues, and I went back to work. That conversation stuck with me. I'd spent so much time focused on my own vindication, on proving I wasn't the villain, that I hadn't really considered how deep the damage went for everyone else involved. My cousin's marriage was falling apart. His reputation was in tatters. His financial situation was a mess. And while I hadn't caused any of it, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but maybe recognition that his choices had cost him far more than a ruined wedding. I don't regret standing my ground. I don't regret refusing to be taken advantage of. But I also realize that boundaries, necessary as they are, come with consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. My business is thriving, my self-respect is intact, and I've learned which family members I can truly rely on. That's worth more than any amount of exposure or goodwill from someone who never valued my work in the first place. I haven't spoken to my cousin since that message where I told him to set the record straight. I don't plan to reach out. If he ever genuinely apologizes, owns his mistakes without deflection or excuses, maybe I'll consider rebuilding something. But I'm not holding my breath. Some bridges burn because they were built on unstable ground to begin with. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.